The history of America begins long before European colonization and Christopher Columbus and all that. There were native civilizations thousands of years old when the first contact between the Old World and the New World was made. The story about the origins of the Americas are as diverse as the beliefs of how the Earth was made. Many scientists and archaeologists believe the first people arrived into the Americas some 10 to 30,000 years ago. The first people, or as the story goes, arrived into the Americas probably by accident. There was a great ice age during the Paleolithic era that caused large ice sheets to expand and over land and water. Waterways receded, and obviously land bridges out of frozen ice were created. These ice sheets and frozen waters allowed the first migrants to make their way into the Americas while pursuing a herd of large mammals that they depended on for survival. The Paleolithic people were nomads, meaning they hunted and gathered, since agriculture was impossible because of the frigid climate during the Ice Age. Supposedly, the first people came into the Americas across the frozen Bering Strait, which is currently located between Alaska and Asian Russia, Siberian region of what's now Russia and Asia. The temporary frozen land bridge was called Beringia. Archaeological sites in Folsom and Clovis, New Mexico were thought to justify this theory as spear points and Clovis points and other artifacts were found that kind of supported that migration into the Alaskan region and then down and out through the Americas. Since then, however, other archaeological evidence in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and South America suggests other possible migration routes, which could have happened even further back and from other regions of the world. We don't know for certain when or where the first people came from. We have evidence, some good evidence, provided by archaeologists and anthropologists that allow us a best guess. This is prehistory. We don't have writing, we don't have documents, we don't have letters like we did when writing started to be prevalent. So that long ago, we can only go by, DNA samples, radiocarbon dating, and analyzing burial sites and things like that to kind of get an idea of what kind of life they lived. But the first people who arrived during the Paleolithic Ice Age did not settle into permanent villages. The climate forced them to constantly hunt and gather in small bands of about 15 to 50 members. They hunted large megafauna like woolly mammoths for all their food, shelter, clothing, tools, and even weapons. Their life was dangerous. They most likely warred with other tribes, and hunting was hard and difficult. Skeletal remains shows constant fractures, or persistent fractures in a lot of them, which suggests that they were probably pretty rough living. To bring down the large mammals on their hunts, the early natives had to use a team technique to kill them. The natives would dig large holes to trap the mammoths in, they'd run them off cliffs, and they would even try to corner them in caves. They would then use spears to finish them off and then tie rocks or stones to the ends of rope, throw across the mammal, and try to drag it down. Eventually, though, the climate was stabilized and it allowed the first natives to move further down and across the Americas. Natives then adapted to their environment like they all did so well. Vegetation began to grow and grasslands began to develop, and they began to supplement their diet with berries and other types of natural vegetation. Large megafauna that thrived in the Ice Age went extinct, and then the natives had to hunt smaller and more elusive game like the deer, the buffalo, antelope. Native hunters developed the atlatl, which was used to project their spears further and faster to kill the more elusive animals. But around 5000 BC, the climate finally stabilized and temperatures similar to what we have now during the Archaic period. In Central America, around present-day Mexico, the natives began to experiment with agriculture. The warmer climate allowed grasslands and forests to grow, and the natives began to genetically engineer grasses and seed to plant the first crops. This agricultural revolution would have a profound effect. Native Americans in Central America began to settle in permanent villages since they could now plant and control their own food somewhat. They did not completely abandon hunting, but they did start to create the first civilizations in the Americas. The settling into one place had multiple effects. The population increased as the food supply increased, and it did not require everyone to harvest the food, which allowed for other professions and skills to develop in the first civilizations. You started to see religious ministers, artisans, craftsmen, pottery makers, and even government institutions because people had more time on their hands. The disadvantage was Native Americans became more dependent on the harvest, which could be devastated by bad weather or climate change, which would result in starvation. Also, more conflict and wars resulted as a population increase, as did diseases. The first staple crops in the Americas were corn, beans, and squash. Natives began to grow them together in a three-sister method, or they called it that. They would plant the corn, and the corn stalk would grow obviously vertical, and then the beans would wrap around the corn stalk, kind of a natural pole for the beans to grow around, and then the squash at the base of the plant would act as a natural mulch that helps keep weeds out. Pretty clever, a little three-sister method. The natives created corn over the decades and generations by mixing seeds and grasses called teosinte grass. Corn first started off as a little bitty cob about the size of your thumb, but it eventually developed into large ears of corn similar to what we have today. The first civilization that developed in present-day Mexico was the Olmec. They were known for their large temple pyramids where they had sacrificial and religious ceremonies and they would bury their dead. They also had large stone faces that archaeologists recovered. They think probably depicted leaders. And they were also known for their rubber ball game. The rubber ball game, or Olmec, really literally means the rubber people. But the Olmecs were the first, we believe, and they kind of set a lot of trends and customs that will be inherited by later Central American civilizations, especially the irrigation for crops and the pyramid mounds and the ball game that some people call Ola ball. I don't know if that's true or not. I just saw it on a cartoon. But around 400 BC, the Olmecs vanished for unknown reasons. Around 300 BC, in the Yucatan Peninsula around present-day Mexico, the great Mayan civilization developed. And like the Olmecs, they practiced sacrificial ceremonies on their elaborate temple pyramids. They planted corn and they played a similar ball game. The Mayans also depended on irrigation and trapping water due to the drier climate in the region. But the Mayans were most known for mathematics and astronomy. They developed a calendar that is scary accurate and is just as accurate as calendars today. And the Mayans developed the concept of zero long before the Europeans. It's just extraordinarily sophisticated civilization there. Around 900 AD, the Mayan civilization succumbed to possible civil wars. It could have been drought and climate change. They could have migrated somewhere else. We're not really sure. Some people even claim that aliens had something to do with it, but if you believe that sort of thing, that's neither here nor there. The warlike Aztecs then developed in what's now Mexico City. They were known for conquering neighbor tribes and annexing them into their empire. Their capital city of Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco was one of the greatest cities in the world. The Aztecs were eventually conquered by the Spanish in the 16th century, mainly because they had loads of gold, and obviously we know Europeans like that sort of thing. Anyway, lots of gold in the Aztec region. The Incas in the Andean region of western South America also developed a large agricultural civilization. They were known for their large terraces dug into the sides of the mountains where they practiced agriculture. That way the water wouldn't just run down the side of the mountain, and they could actually plant something that would get sunlight consistently. The Incas also developed the potatoes, what they were most known for. And no, we all think of Ireland when we think of potatoes, but the potato was actually native to the Incas in the Americas, and it was brought to the European regions. They also domesticated the llama, which they used for clothing, they used for milk, and even just killed it and eat it for the meat. Eventually, the Incas were conquered by Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish during the 16th century. Eventually, Native American agriculture and civilization began to develop in the lands that are now present-day United States. The climate warmed quicker in the Central American region than it did north of Mexico, which is why agriculture and civilization developed there before they did in the present-day United States. Many of the same customs that the Mayas and Aztecs practiced were also practiced in the native civilizations north of Mexico, especially in the Southwest. None of the civilizations north of Mexico would develop as fully as the Central American civilizations, but they would have many similarities. And contrary to popular belief, Native Americans did not live in harmony with each other and nature, as typically depicted by people who constantly vilify European settlers and traditional American culture. Now, to be sure, there are some Europeans and some American history that does deserve to be criticized because they did treat some Native Americans poorly. But Native Americans were guilty of the same injustices as any other culture. Native Americans enslaved people. They warred and conquested other tribes. They sacrificed people. They even ate people and practiced cannibalism. This does not mean that they were all bad and all did that, but we should judge history fairly. There were good people and bad people in each group. But in recent history textbooks, the story of America is one of oppression and injustice, and it ignores the good people in each group who got along well and did great things, who really lived up to those founding principles. There were instances where Europeans and Americans treated Native Americans well. They even intermarried with them, such as some French settlers, and even Kit Carson, for a little while anyway, before he got kicked out of the TP. This does not justify the poor treatment of Native Americans by some, but it is something that anyone with a broad perspective should consider when reflecting on history. We should not compare the best of one culture with the worst of another. The first pre-Columbian civilizations that developed above Mexico were the Hohokam Anasazi in the present-day Southwest, the Andina Hopewell in the present-day Ohio River Valley, and the Mississippians in the Southeast and up into the Missouri River Valley. The Hohokam Anasazi grew corn and depended heavily upon irrigation like Central American cultures. The Hohokam lived in southern Arizona, and the Anasazi lived in the Four Corners regions where the present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado and Utah met. They were known as the Pueblos, as the Spanish called them, because of their clay structures, apartment-like living structures they built into the sides of canyons. They were sometimes referred as the Cliff Dwellers for that same reason. The Hopi, Zuni, and the Navajo Indians are descendants of the Hohokam Anasazi, and they most likely perished because of climate change, which decimated their crops, because we know the Southwest now is not suitable for agriculture. The Andina Hopewells were best known for their burial mounds that were stretched horizontally and they were shaped like serpents and animals. They practiced agriculture to an extent and hunted and gathered. The Mississippians, who were also Eastern Woodland Indians, were known for their large vertical burial mounds that could be seen in places like Moundville, Alabama, and Cahokia, Illinois. Some mounds were over 100 feet tall. They practiced agriculture and hunted and gathered as well. When Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492 in the Bahamas, there were over 10,000 native-speaking tribes and over 400 different languages throughout the Americas. The Eastern Woodland Indians were broken down by 3 different language groups, and we're talking about Native Americans at the time of arrival. We're not talking about early ancient civilizations anymore. In the Eastern Woodlands, you had the Algonquin, Iroquois, and Muskegon language-speaking tribes. They were a blend of hunter-gathering tribes, and some practiced extensive agriculture. Some of the Eastern Woodland tribes practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, in which they would burn fields and forests to open up new land for more cultivation and to fertilize the ground. The Algonquins lived close to the coast and rivers, and they practiced agriculture very little. The Algonquin-speaking Wampanoags welcomed pilgrims when they landed in present-day Massachusetts and helped them grow crops. They celebrated what would become the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Many Eastern Woodland natives lived in wigwams and fished and traded heavily. The Cherokee, who were Iroquois, lived in present-day Tennessee and North Georgia. They mainly farmed, but the men hunted frequently. Therefore, the women were known to head the tribes since the men were out hunting a lot. Other Iroquois tribes lived in western New York to the Great Lakes. The Muskegon tribes lived in the southeastern states of Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Those tribes included the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. The natives of the Great Plains tribes were a little different than the Eastern Woodland natives. They were primarily nomadic due to the difficulty in harvesting crops in the dry and hard soil of the plains. They are known for their buffalo hunts, teepee living structures, and the first people to domesticate the horse. Some of the Plains tribes were the Sioux, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and the Crow. The Western tribes included the tribes of the Plateau, West Coast, the Northwest, and the Southwest, which they varied from nomadic hunters and gatherers to fishing and some agriculture depending on the region and climate. But all natives were spiritual people. They believed in nature and animal spirits. They believed that if they were in good graces with nature and the animal spirits, that their hunts and harvests and warring parties would be successful. Natives did not believe in private ownership of land. They believed that each member in the tribe had a specific role that helped everyone in the tribe. But the beginning of European colonization would be the beginning of the decimation of Native American culture. Many were decimated in conflicts with Europeans and Americas over the years, but the overwhelming majority succumbed to European diseases such as smallpox.